So welcome to the 14th monthly seminar of Creatures. Creatures is a project that is looking at a very broad spectrum of creative practices and how they can contribute to what we say eco-social sustainability. And in these seminars, we invite people who come from very different backgrounds, both from creative practice, from sustainability, and from policy, to kind of explain to us how they understand the key notions of the project, such as transformation and sustainability. And today it's going to be a slightly different session, more hands-on than usual. So I'm really happy to introduce Roy Bendor, who is an associate professor of critical design at the Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands. So he's also my neighbor in the same country. Who will be having first a short introduction on the use of speculative design as a kind of means to talk about urban technologies, and then we will try out in small groups a kind of urban futuring exercise, which he called value replacement therapy. So with that, I won't say much more. I will just give the floor to Roy directly. Thank you and welcome.
Thanks. Thank you for the introduction, Christina. It's great to be here. Since there aren't too many people, and before I share my screen, if you're with us, can you just turn on the camera so I can say hi and see you before I kind of share my screen and disappear into the ether? Hey, some familiar faces, some familiar names. Hello. So thanks for joining us. I hope you'll enjoy today's session. So I'm going to start to share my screen. Cool, you should be able to see it. Yep, all good? All right, perfect. Cool. So thanks again for the invitation, Christina. It's been a while since I wanted to come hang out with some creatures and friends. So I'm glad that I can finally do it. When I was preparing the talk, I looked over the project website and looked at some previous seminars, and I really got a sense that what's kind of at the center and common to this community is this kind of shared interest in stretching the imagination. And by this, I mean something more or less like what Ursula Le Guin meant when she described poets and other visionaries as realists of a larger reality. So like many of you, I'm committed to opening up new and sometimes old ways to see the world, to expand reality and our capacity to act on it. But I wasn't always like this, I must admit. I started life in academia studying philosophy, film and media, and I was mostly trained in critical theory and Marxian analysis of the media, so very much kind of Frankfurt School theory, where the goal is really to reveal reality for what it is, right? So there's always this kind of gap between critique and its objects. The task of critical theorists is to remove this ideological veil of ignorance, right? To show the public real reality. So in a sense, there's always I find a kind of a safety in these kind of modes of criticism from above, where the critic stands somehow outside the system that they're addressing, almost unaffected by the results of their analysis. So I started to think about how to close this gap of critique in my own work during my postdoc, where I took part in creating an interactive multimedia installation called Sustainability in an Imaginary World. The goal here was to experiment with ways to consider sustainability as a question of ontological pluralism. So using a combination of theater, storytelling, interactive media to really open up questions about the kind of the deep foundations of the world. We really wanted to consider sustainability as this kind of invitation to create worlds, or to do what I later called world making. You could read about this in a very cool paper that I wrote with Joost. Is Joost with us? Maybe, yes, maybe later, and a few other colleagues. So check that out if you want. So in retrospect, the installation was perhaps overly ambitious, shall we say. But the process of its creation and evaluation taught me something about the power of art, not only to represent the world, but as a distinct form of inquiry. I've always also experienced firsthand the difficulties of creating art that is both engaging and conceptually sophisticated. So anyway, once I started to work at Delft, which is coming up 6 years now, I really became interested, like so many others, in speculative design. And So I'm assuming that I don't really need to say too much about it. After all, you know, you can't open a journal these days or any kind of design website without, you know, coming face to face with it, to the point that even Dunn and Raby themselves no longer use the term. But in my reading, what makes speculative design such an interesting practice is not only the way that it materializes social critique, and so it gives designers a form of critical practice, but also the way that it engages the world in and through provocation, which, as you know, is quite a common strategy in socially engaged art. So what I find so appealing in speculative design is that it's both an approach and a congruent aesthetic vocabulary. That's at least how I see it. So these days, I use speculative design to explore and communicate the social implications of the smart city. You may have heard of the smart city. As Rem Koolhaas, the Starchitect, commented, it's practically irresistible to not want to have a smart city if you're a mayor. So it's a kind of an irresistible urban design paradigm. And it also represents, and this is, I think, very important, a global market of somewhere between $200 and $800 billion annually, depends on who you're asking. So there's certainly a lot of money involved here. And so a strong assumption that grounds my work in the smart city is that although the city, you know, heavily relies on a technical infrastructure that includes, you know, anything from sensors, cameras, networks, algorithms, servers, etc., the city is not reducible to its material infrastructure. It is, as Jathan Sadowski and I put it, it's a sociotechnical imaginary, not our term, of course. And what we mean by that is that the smart city is an idea with political power, right? So it shapes what we think the city is, and consequently, what we think the city should be. Another way to think about the smart city, and alongside Gillian Rose here, is something that is kind of generated by the traffic between cultural texts and everyday experiences, both of which are increasingly mediated by urban technologies. So I find that the key to engaging with the smart city then is to address its technical infrastructure, but always in relation to its discursivity, so the role that it plays in discourses on future cities. So what makes the smart city particularly difficult to engage with is the way that its technical infrastructure is ubiquitous yet opaque. So it's really everywhere, but we don't always know that it's there. It's complex, but it's also black boxed. Sometimes people who design urban technologies don't really understand how the technologies work. It's kind of the, you know, case of the proof is in the pudding. If it works, it works. And it's often privately owned, and so it evades public scrutiny. Something that you know, Keller Easterling talks about. She talks about, you know, these kind of zones of extra statecraft where the city now is growing. So we know that the city is saturated with sensors and cameras. Last I saw, in Amsterdam alone, there were over 20,000 sensors and cameras, and we know that these are increasingly used to make decisions that affect everyday life. But we can't always tell where this infrastructure is. As the title of a previous project I was involved in goes, you know, you can't trip over data the same way that you trip over a crack in a sidewalk. So even if you do become aware of technology's presence, it's difficult to understand how it's used by whom and with what consequences. And so the result is that urban technology often appears immutable. It's resistant to public scrutiny. And so the smart city becomes something that happens to us, not something that we are engaged with. So in response to that, I've been trying to render smart city infrastructure more malleable, first as an object of the imagination, and then as a site for collective action. I started by working with students on speculative design that targets the smart city's reliance on data and algorithms. And so I thought I'd show you just a few examples to kind of see where we were. So this is Escape the Smart City by Tomo Chiara. And the point here was to use a kind of a familiar gamified genre, you know, the escape room, to really think about how image recognition works these days. So there was a whole narrative about a new system about to come online in the city that will concentrate and centralize all the surveillance systems. And players here have to find ways to hack the system, moving or merging between digital and non-digital environments, figuring out how to fool cameras, how image recognition works. And as you can imagine, at the end, if they managed to do that on time, they realized that the whole process of hacking was actually a way for the system to kind of grow its own immunity. So, you start as kind of a black hat hacker and you end up as a white hat hacker. Ooh, try to say that fast. Pardon me. Yeah. I'm recovering from COVID, so if you hear me going into a fit of coughs, don't be alarmed unless I turn blue. So this is Pigeon Predictions by Peter Kalkman. And the idea here was to think about what if wildlife becomes enrolled as part of the smart cities algorithmic or data system. And what Peter was speculating about was putting little RF sensors on pigeons, and then being able, based on understanding pigeon behavior, to figure out, for instance, which benches are used more than others, because usually it's old people and kids who like to sit around benches and feed pigeons, or which garbage dumpsters are overrun, because when pigeons eat, they have a particular kind of way that they move around the food. And which homes remain vacant, because apparently, and I didn't know this, pigeons like to sleep in empty houses. And so Peter built a whole kind of system of mapping and tracking, and with these kind of fake speculative algorithms that generate intelligence from pigeons. And after he presented this in the New Institute in Rotterdam, people from the city actually approached him and asked if it's feasible, and whether he could help them kind of try to test it. So makes you wonder. My last example is the smart bench experience from Juyong Park. And what Juyong did was add all kinds of actuators and motors and sensors and cameras to a regularly looking bench, and then use that bench as a mechanism for nudging. So if based on people's physical attributes, people were weighed, and heavier people are not allowed to sit for long, because everybody knows obese people need to exercise. And there's cameras that look at the quality of shoes of people, so using socioeconomic markers like that, and not allowing people with old shoes to sit too long, so they don't sleep on the benches at night. And there's also ways to gauge people's ethnicity, and a way to reduce or increase safety by reducing noise pollution. Apparently, people of Middle Eastern origin are the ones who mostly kind of loiter around and make noise. And so, this is quite a racist bench ultimately. And what makes this experience really nice is that after you sit on the bench and you experience its nudging, so you sit for a bit and then things go off, sounds, vibrations, and that kind of stuff. You can go and look at the actual algorithm and how it's set up, and then you could practice being a nudger yourself. So it's I don't know, kind of a California prison experiment gone wrong in a way as well. So I hope you'll agree these are all thought-provoking designs, and they make a clear the kind of value sensitivity that urban infrastructure holds. But they left me with several questions about speculative design. So I wanted to raise those questions and kind of leave them maybe as things first to think about, perhaps later in discussion as well. And the first thing that I was wondering about is that, if the act of speculation, and not just its reception by an audience, but that speculation itself yields such insightful and actionable outcomes, shouldn't we extend its benefits to non-designers? I mean, can we make speculation a collective inclusive activity, to practice collective dreaming, as Dunn and Raby themselves intended, but have never really delivered, I think. So this is one thing. Something else that I keep thinking about is, if speculative design is to make a real impact, shouldn't it be made more relevant to specific communities in which it's practiced or to which it pertains? I mean, doesn't a kind of universal speculative design, targeting very, large sociotechnical developments, doesn't it merely reproduce the same kind of problematic logic of the smart city in this case, assuming that all cities, all communities, all forms of imagination are the same? So where's there room for things to be really, really specifically different? Something else that comes to mind, and I know at least several of you would agree, is that, I think it's quite undeniable that creating and experiencing speculative design has impact. I mean, people walk away with it with different things happening to them. But I really think that we lack rigorous ways to assess it. So, you know, if speculative design is to take a seat at the table occupied by other forms of socially engaged design, you know, participatory design, autonomous design, etc., shouldn't we develop effective frameworks to evaluate its success? Of course, easier said than done. The same argument can be made on so many other forms of art, right? How do we know when art is successful? And not just asking the market. The last thing that I'm thinking about is, you know, if we consider all of these questions, I think it's important that we reassess also the role of designers in speculative design. I mean, you know, are we content with designers voicing or, you know, kind of channeling, representing the public imagination? Or should we envision and train designers to be something else, perhaps more like gardeners, sowing seeds of the imagination, or midwives delivering the public imagination? So I've been trying to develop responses to these questions in several projects, two of them more important. The first, which I will not discuss today, is called Alternative Imaginaries for the Smart City. And you can find out more about it on our new website. It's alternative-imaginaries.nl. But in a nutshell, what that project tries to do is to combine ethnography and co-design and speculative design to suggest new ways to develop sensors from the community up, so to speak. But the second thing I've been working on, drumroll, is value replacement therapy, which is what I'm hoping that we all get a chance to kind of play with today. So my goal with VRT, as I call it endearingly, is to create an exercise that is both accessible and flexible and scalable. So it's really premised in a search for, I think, the design equivalent of what the counterfactual historians call minimal rewrite rules, right? So what is the kind of minimal trigger, the minimal switch of thinking that we can do to really open up new ways to think both about technologies and about the world in this case? And as you can see from this amazing diagram, the general movement in the exercise is really from technology to world. So the VRT starts by thinking about specific urban technologies, and then it moves towards world building. So, you know, if you know Stuart Candy's game, The Thing from the Future, VRT operates in exactly the opposite way. So instead of giving you a world and asking you to design an object, it flips it around. So the version that you'll play with today has 3 stages and 4 steps. So there's a value analysis, and it's followed by a reimagining of the technology. And it concludes with a brief statement about a future world in which this new technology might be accepted. But when time allows, the same exercise could be done with additional world building steps. I've facilitated before by ending up with all kinds of like pastel analysis, really kind of fleshing out what a future world could look like, you know, a world in which these kind of reimagined technologies could actually work. And during the Urban Futures Studio Summer School, I facilitated it together with Lenneke Koyer from TU Eindhoven, a version of VRT that ended up with role-playing as well, which was super, super fun. But we don't have enough time to do that because all we have is 20 minutes. So this is what VRT kind of looks like. This is the whole Miro board. I'll send you the link in a second. We'll put you into breakout rooms, and based on the number of your breakout room, you will find your specific worksheet. And in the middle here of the whole board, you'll see 2 things. On the left is an index of technologies, just to make sure that you recognize the technology that's in the picture. And next to it is the values wheel, which I'll say something a bit more in a second. If you've never used a Miro before, I don't know if you know, in these COVID days, someone has not used it before, but sticky notes are on the left. At the bottom, there'll be a clock, and you can zoom in and out on the bottom right side, playing with the plus and minuses. I think that's pretty much all you have to know about Miro. This is the values wheel in the middle, and it's based on Shalom Schwartz's work. And the beauty in this is that it really creates like a geometrical or a kind of spatial understanding of values. And so once you figure out what is the value that is most dominant in the technology that was assigned to you, you will essentially go to the inverse value, automatic. You don't have to spend too much time. You just choose the one across and start reimagining the technology from that value. The trick here is that there are 9 values here. So there isn't one across. There's always 2 across. So you will have to make some decision about which value you want to play with. And so my recommendation is don't spend too much time on it. It works either way. It doesn't matter too much. You'll find the detailed instructions on the left side of each worksheet. As you can see, this is how it looks. Shouldn't be too hard. I've already put a few sticky notes in each board to save you some time, but you can always add more sticky notes. And something else to keep in mind is that I used here a mix of urban technology, so both smart city technologies like the scan car that you see here, but also some standard urban technologies of infrastructure like a bench or a water fountain. And I do this in part to demonstrate that really all technologies have values, are based on values. And so the exercise could really be done pretty much with any technology. So I will be the timekeeper. As I said, we'll give you 20 minutes for this. Yeah, this is very rapid. We're doing this really, really roughshod, quick and dirty. So my recommendation is don't take too long to make decisions. Just kind of go with the flow. All your choices are good today. It's the idea is to really get kind of a flavor of what this exercise could do and not come up with the best designs. Of course, if you have questions, pop back to the main room. I'll be here and happy to help. And otherwise, I'll see you here in about 20 minutes. And well, no less important, try to have fun with it. So that was my introduction. Christina, you will put everyone in rooms, right? So we'll put everybody in groups of 3. Whoever's left.
Yeah, so everyone should be assigned in a room already. So.
All right. And in the chat, I have posted the Miro board. So welcome back, survivors. Did the procedure go okay? Was the value therapy successful? New values have been installed and we're ready to take on the future. I guess we have about 15 minutes to talk about anything. I thought maybe we just start by just quick responses if you have any about how was it like, and if you came up with something really cool at the end and you want to share it, that'll be nice as well. Do we need to formalize or just jump in or whatever? Anybody feels like starting? Or not at all? I feel like we can also just stare silently into Tara's background image. Imagine that we're somewhere floating in the cosmos. Ah, Tara, you ruined it.
No, I'm the cosmos too.
Hey, I see a hand risen. Hey.
Hey,
Lara.
Lara at Anne's house. I'm pretending
Oh,
to be Anne.
That's so cool that you get to hang out together.
I know, in real life, right? It's so
awesome.
We're having a work meeting, and which yes, so that but we were very much enjoying the opportunity to do something a bit different together.
So in our group, in group 2, Johannes asked us were we new to the values wheel, and I wondered, actually, was this like quite a common tool that people were using?
The article in which Shalom Schwartz introduces this is, I think, 2006, if I'm not mistaken. So it has been around, and I've been using it for maybe 2 years now, both in this exercise and others, just because it's such an easy way to communicate something that is so complex. But of course, you lose something with the simplification. Especially the boundaries between the values are somewhat porous, and to really kind of, well, you don't want to sit and read the entire article if you're just doing an exercise, right? So it really helped just to kind of plug a hole for me in that sense. But it's been around, and Schwartz, I think, is quite known for his work on values, so it didn't come out of nowhere. What technology did you guys use? What was assigned to you?
The scanning car, which was really interesting because I read it as like a Google Maps car that is like a mapping thing, and Johannes recognized it and was able to say, no, this is a security technology. And it was quite an interesting one. We had a really good discussion about well, the nature of surveillance, and kind of the opposite was self-direction. And we were thinking, wow, how do we reappropriate this apparatus that might be kind of connected into like a number plate recognition database? Or do we say, oh, actually the democratized version of this is already available with like dash cams, and people already kind of use technologies in their cars for loads of really weird and interesting purposes. But we came up with quite an interesting proposal, I think, in the end.
Super cool. The city of Amsterdam is obsessed with smart cars. I can go on for this, but obsessed with smart cars. It's one of the key technologies that they're bringing in. They have dozens of those, and nobody really knows what they do and what to do with them. But that's a different conversation. First of all, they're out there. More comments, more sharing, anything at all.
May I ask one question that is linked also to previous presentation that you made and this exercise? The word therapy, how do you understand it? Where is the power of therapy lying? And yeah, what you are aiming with this therapy?
Yeah, I really wish I had a clever answer to that, but it's a dad joke. I think it's just a word play on gene replacement therapy, and to some extent, I think that what we do here is that we just pull out and replace. So I really wish I had something much more clever about how this relates to other things, but I'm known for dad jokes, so it's very much in character.
Because I think, if we read now diagnosis of our society, I think many are claiming that our society is massively ill, that everyone is traumatized and wounded in a different way. So I don't know how, maybe it's a bit invitation. How would you see how this approach could heal society? Yeah.
Wow, it's a really good question. I mean, there's no doubt the society is ill in certain ways, and certainly our planet is ill. Right, don't have to be a climate scientist to recognize that. I guess to some extent, the ability to imagine things otherwise is both at the core of therapy, right? Otherwise, why would you agree to any therapy if there isn't a part of you that accepts it, that there's potential for change at the end? But I have to admit, I haven't really thought about it in that way as kind of a. I borrowed some of the affect of the term without really dressing it in a kind of a much more robust kind of view here. So, see, Johannes has a hand up. Great question, though, Natalia.
Thanks. I liked your introduction where you talked about these exercises as a form of critical analysis or critique, and you talked about your the more Marxist background. If you would think about this as exercise then and translate it into social science criticism, is this more a post-structural version than with its multiple values abound and the ability to play with different standing points instead of assuming a particular class-based or otherwise?
I think it's a pretty good way to put it. I can imagine instead of the values wheel, right, one can introduce any other kind of social system, right? So you could probably insert the class, race, ethnic background, and try to imagine technology from that perspective. So in that sense, again, I really went for what I think. So in design, like the question of values is one that has been raised, really only in the last 20 years with value-sensitive design, and so it's something that people are still learning to kind of work with, and it's one of our favorite hand-waving things. Pay attention to values, and then designers just do whatever the heck they want to. And so that was part of the target here, was to actually show that all technology is value-based. Yeah, I wonder, do you think that if this was more of a kind of a more traditional kind of class-based, it would still, would we be able to even get off the first, right, the first stage, just to decide, our own kind of class position and how it kind of is kind of co-created with the technology as well? You think that would work?
I think the exercise strikes me. I mean, it's not critical theory in the sense of being a revelation of the true values behind, because it's much more fluid and multiple, that you choose a particular starting point and then see the world from within that one and you try to flip it. It has that much more kind of critique where it's nothing assumed or revealed, and much more, trying to identify, subject position or a value somewhere, and then look at the technology from there and then flip it.
Yeah, that's really what I was going for. And my claim is you can plug in any technology and start from any value. It really doesn't matter. What matters is a sense of malleability. The sense that I think Anne has a nice way to describe this as well, right? The world is designed and therefore it's designable, right? So things have been made in a particular way, and it doesn't mean that they're immutable and therefore unchangeable. And to some extent, maybe that's the root grain of any kind of critical theory, right? It doesn't have to be as traditional as Marxist or not. Just, the world, we should ask questions. Why is the world the way that it is, and why can't it be otherwise? So it comes from a lack of satisfaction with there's a reason why I framed that way, with kind of like the standard critical position. It's much more flexible. Thanks for that. Victor, you're next.
I also touched on some of the points I wanted to direct. I just wanted to say that I really liked the exercise, and we got the bench in our team, and it was a challenge for what I found regarding the value. We went with hedonism, which is not maybe the first choice if you think about the bench, but pleasure and the good life and well-being was the one why we went there, and then finding the opposites in the value wheel. I didn't find that it's really an opposite, because we went with help and helpfulness. So it was I like to have a low tech object, and I like to think about the values, and this is what I think is the strength of the exercise, that this intervention or creating a bifurcation so that the system could go either way, thinking in opposites, was quite helpful. And I also believe that the value wheel, as you also mentioned, is one way, but there could be other triggers that help us to think in opposite. And in creativity theory, just as positioning or flipping the problem to another plane is like a trigger, and thinking in alternative futures is an overwhelming task. So before you want to think about the whole big thing, having the good triggers installed is a really fruitful strategy. I really like that. That would have been my comment.
That's really, really nice to hear. Thanks. I think choosing hedonism is very, very, it's quite innovative, and I can see how that could potentially create problems later. But going back to the question of how to imagine the world, right? We know we never start from a blank slate, right? Any blue sky exercise is kind of doomed to begin with. There has to be a platform to start. And then the kind of question that I'm trying to ask with value replacement therapy is, what is the minimum that we need to do this, right? And I'm very much here kind of inspired by the thing from the future that Stuart Candy in the Situation Lab did, which I think is a brilliant example of how a very small set of prompts can really get your kind of imaginative juices flowing. But there's no questions of values there. It's just fun. There's no potential for social critique unless you start shaping it, like adding rules to the game. And so I'd be really curious, if not values, what would be the other kind of minimal rewrite rule for design that could make this exercise? Because it's like the second time here that we're thinking about it. I'm really, really curious. Maybe that's something to think about collectively, where it can go. I see Anne, you have a comment, but I think Louise had her hand first. So.
Hi, I was just going to comment that, well, first of all, thank you for the exercise, because I've found it a really valuable exercise to go through, and we really enjoyed it. In our group, we had the surveillance camera, And we chose the dominant value as power and our new value as universalism, which was like an understanding, appreciation, a tolerance for and protection. And so it still involved a lot of elements that a surveillance camera is supposed to capture. So we found that in any kind of retelling, we were coming up against a lot of the same hurdles, which I thought was a really interesting thing about the exercise. You know, we started to think about how we could not record but still keep track. Maybe it would be a Snapchat style record, or maybe it would be even something like body cams, but used in a way that was much less kind of intrusive, in a way that could somehow just be more disposable, but at least if people knew they were there. But everything seemed to keep coming back to this kind of sense of surveillance that really troubled us. So I found that element interesting, that even though we'd flipped the values, we were still having some issues with that. But then we ended up coming up with this kind of crazy idea of something about enforced storytelling, which in the end sounded a bit like, I don't know, publishing a new version of a rag press, perhaps, but the idea of some kind of community-based storytelling and sharing. But ultimately, I suppose the point that I wanted to make was that even in flipping the values, we still found it really hard not to be in a place where we were recreating some of the same problems that you get through subjectivity, particularly in the question of surveillance, which was really interesting for us as well.
Yeah, that's a really interesting comment. I wonder if it's generalizable to the imagination. I'm just kind of, you know, spitballing here, that there's some things that are so strong that we can never let them go. You know, we see certain aspects of the world that they're colored so strongly already with kind of our worldview, our ideological positions, our values and whatnot. And, you know, it's nice to be able to spin the wheel, so to speak, but sometimes, you know, you just can't.
I think though in this exercise for us, it was more a case of, you know, I think maybe given time, we'd have managed to stretch far enough away from the original. But I thought it might, you know, it was worth sort of commenting on the fact that that was something that we, you know, found quite interesting to grapple with.
Thanks. I'm glad to hear. Anne and Lara, which one of you?
I put
It was
my
Lara
hand
that
up
put the hand up.
and I
in
the chat.
Yeah, it's just a comment.
I was interested that you chose artifacts that are part of infrastructures, except perhaps the bench. And what does it change if you then begin to look into the infrastructural system? What would it change if these were infrastructures instead of artifacts that you were asking people to flip?
Oh, but we much said the same thing then, because my comment, for anyone who couldn't see it, was essentially what we ended up changing was the governance structure rather than the object. But I think it comes back to Louise's point very well, that how far is the object determining, once you create a surveillance object, how far does it have to be an object of surveillance? And then it's about who's controlling the surveillance versus whether you actually have worlds there where you repurpose it and it isn't about surveillance anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you essentially get to learn both about the kind of value saturation of technologies, but also that you can't think of them in isolation. So every technology is embedded in a set of practices, of whether it's governance or everyday practices, worldviews and whatnot. And so there's a little bit of a sleight of hand here. No, it's a little bit of a trick. This starting from a technology and thinking that you could move to the world, while every technology is a product of a world in itself. And there's a circularity, and we can never entirely, I think, move out of it. But I've facilitated this game with using sidewalks, crosswalks, drains, so rain drains, so like hardcore kind of city infrastructure that really we don't think about as reflective of any kind of values. I mean, come on, it's a sidewalk. But then it makes it quite interesting as well, because then once people flip the value, it kind of pushes them to think creatively about what a sidewalk could be or what a crosswalk could be. And I think there's value in exercising the imagination even in those cases. But I think it's harder, the harder, the more kind of stable the infrastructure is, it's harder to do this kind of analysis, but still fun. I think Ina asked about the mirror board. I'll leave it open. it's not a problem at all. I'll keep it open for another week or two or whatever. Whenever I feel like it, I'll take it off. And if you feel like there's more that you want to say about this, or if you want to get in touch, then my email is, was it shown anywhere? Anyway, Christina can show you, or it was on the seminar. So please do get in touch. And I know we passed time, but if you want to ask more or chat more, I'm happy to stick around for as long. It's so nice to see people and not just be alone at home in the gray Den Haag winter. Anyway, so if you have to leave, thanks for joining, and if not, yeah.
In the spirit of moving into the informal section, apart from just saying, actually, it was lovely to have an interactive component, and thank you, really nice to meet Ina and to see Johannes. Was just to actually comment on something which is quite specific, and so I hope I'm not boring others, but if we're going into the informal section, I'm taking that liberty, which is, we were just commenting on the fact that you've picked these really high profile, contentious type of technologies, which is a really good starting point for engaging certain types of people in the work that is done to unpick what that means. So I think it almost has its audience written in a way. It's really interesting to think about who might be interested in thinking through different values for these urban objects, kind of thing. And I was just comparing it with the work that I've been doing, which I think you know, but probably other people don't, so forgive me for being, but it's about creating a world where there are different values, and then thinking about what the objects that come from those values are, and then how interesting it would be to perhaps play something between these two, where you could go from something, yours is very embedded in a way, but it starts to ask the question of what happens if you invert, or something where you're making a whole new world and then saying, well, what would come out of it? I think there's a really nice conversation between them.
I entirely agree. Would be kind of cool to see if you're starting from different positions where it takes you.
You can have the battle of the values artifacts.
Yeah, but
this would be really fun to do something where we actually maybe put people through these things and looked at what happens.
Yeah, exactly. I tend to think of it less as a battle and more as a comparative framework that I think we're lacking a lot. So one of my comments in general about speculative design, the kind of questions I raise is that, part of the way to assess them is to compare them to what, right? But to what do you compare a speculative design object to? A regular object? I mean, it's kind of unfair. Do you compare it to a work of art? Well, designers would stand on their hind legs and be like, no, we're not artists. And I had these conversations, right, where speculative designers like, no, we're not artists, because if we're artists, then now we're in this box and we don't like that box. So
but I think it speaks to the fact that these should not be regarded as objects. They should be regarded as hybrids of object and process. And what you're doing is creating a really interesting process for your object. Because if you just gave me a scan car, then all I would have is a scan car. I wouldn't be responding to it as anything other than, oh my God, one of those came down my way once, or Lara thought it was from Google, and Johannes knows that it works in a different way. There's no context. So as soon as you put something, you frame it with some kind of process by even putting us all together like this, but you give us a wheel of values and you tell us to flip. That's actually what we're comparing. What work is that doing when it's related to a scan car?
Yeah. I totally agree. Christina and I were talking as everybody was on the Miro board about the fact that in many cases the outcomes, like the actual objects that people redesign, are either not very imaginative or are ridiculous, or sometimes it just doesn't work. And it really is the process, like the kind of the immediate understanding of this kind of malleability, right? Things could be shaped at work. I've done one iteration of this with people from Dutch government, from a Ministry of Infrastructure, and the objects were determined. So I said, these are the kind of objects that I've been working so far, but obviously this is not relevant to the bureaucrats here. So I gave them a list of objects, and we had a back and forth, and we ended up with things like a window, like things that were just incredibly difficult to flip, like just really, really, really difficult. And it was kind of a high profile profile session, like we got paid for it, and there were like professional sketchers who were working with the groups to create prototypes, and so they ended up with prototypes that were way beyond anything that I would think in terms of the some of their sophistication, but it didn't feel right. I don't know how to really put my finger on it, but it didn't go to the edges of what kind of a radical imagination or a socially radical imagination could have brought it. It stayed very much on kind of a bureaucratic level, and I haven't entirely kind of extracted lessons from that about whether I should limit the kind of objects, or whether I should de-emphasize the design process maybe towards something else, right? So really bring the process into the forefront more than the object. I mean,
it's really interesting what sliders one gets, in a sense of what you can tweak and what you play out, what you play down. I mean, I was thinking of some work we did with Swedish civil servants using the method I was talking about, and the designers amongst us, and there were lots of other people together with some civil servants, but it was the people who had spent most of their time being really practical about having to create workable solutions for the city, who found themselves most resistant to the playful element. And subsequently realized, first of all, that they were often better together than put in a group with people who were more antagonistic to that kind of very more literal approach, perhaps, so that they could work together in a like group. But also that if you said to them a little bit like, we know your job is like this, but in this case you want to do something a bit different and see how it feels, there was more traction. So it was really interesting about how people actually manage their imaginations, and then what process they went through to support that. So yeah, I think this is really, there's so much potential even within one structure like yours, which I was really enjoying, or any of these things, to see how to make it most useful for the people that you're trying to support.
So customizability, I think, is important, and flexibility. So being able to kind of move things around and still have confidence that the overall framework will yield something. I had very similar experience to what you're describing, but I had some, like some of the worst experience around VRT were actually with design students. And for two reasons. At least our design students are very solution oriented. And they were like, okay, so I don't know, a water fountain is meant to give you water, so I have to stick to that functionality by hook, come hell or high water. This is what the object will have to do, whether I flip the values or not. And I thought that it actually limited their ability to really play with it. While some of the bureaucrats, I think, because they saw that nothing, at least the ones that I worked with, because we carved a space for them around the exercise, and they didn't feel like this has to lead to anything immediate that they're doing, they surprised us. So again, they didn't, I don't think they digested the social aspects of it as much as I was hoping they would, like the kind of, the understanding that malleability is a political characteristic. It's not just a technical, right? It's socio-technical. But that little bubble that they were in just allowed them to go crazy and to really enjoy it. And so they felt the malleability in some sense, but not its social aspects on the other. So different groups, just, I have more examples. I think I've done this maybe 7 or 8 times at this point with maybe 150 different people. So I'm starting to see patterns coming up a little bit. I usually ask people to fill a survey. I didn't do it here, but to fill a survey at the end, where that allows me to kind of generate a bit more kind of patterns. But
and it's great when you've done it so often that it doesn't it stops being random, doesn't it? Anyway, sorry, Laura, you were going to say something.
Yeah, like if we recognize that values are kind of situated and enacted in practice, then whatever group you get together that's a values laden process. And what you're talking about, Anne, is like surfacing those values and expectations to be able to free people to do something different. So something about using the values wheel in the group at the start of the thing to say, well, what kind of values space are we in now before we go into the exercise? Like being able to recognize that in like a professional context, people do feel circumscribed, that like if you're a policy implementer, that efficiency and value for money are core to your job, and that if you're speaking from a position of professional praxis in a workshop situation, or if you're a design student, that the same like functionality central to what you expect the values to be in that situation, so that you need to recognize that the situation that the workshop creates is already values laden, and then invite people to do something different, because then you will get maybe a different outcome.
I think everybody who's ever tried to do like public engagement, you know, public dialogues, realize that the first bit, which sometimes looks like it takes forever, is just kind of a clarification of who you're engaging with, right? Everybody comes, and the first thing they want you to know is who they are, what's their worldview, what are their values, what they're representing, right? And so there's never kind of a jumping into the actual issue. There's always the pre, you know. And it's very important, right? So whenever I facilitate these processes, I always make sure that there's enough time for that, for everybody to put their position on the table before they're willing to kind of maybe let go of some of the things that hold them back. But VRT doesn't have that, right? It's just like, it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter, you know, what are your values. Like this is a starting point. Now run with it. You know, whether you can or can't is a different question. But and that's why I would see this as maybe as a starter. You know, it's an appetizer in a longer process. Maybe something that would actually yield. You know, if I'd wanted to really create like interesting objects, and maybe it's a starting point, and then you start adding to, you know, the world building really takes off, and you can really kind of come up with interesting technical ideas. But yeah, I don't know if that kind of speaks a little bit to what you're saying. Yeah, Victor.
I thought I to add the last comment before Christina kicks us out. First, I'm just really happy to having met you today, and really looking forward to meet you very, very soon again. And I think in working a similar vein too. But now about the question about values and how the process is more important than the design outcome, with which obviously also what I think our group was focusing on. I'm thinking step 4 with the headline, it could also encourage participants to include into the account reactionary positions, like how the bench that we redesigned for something more social also triggered a backlash of people who just want to be left alone, and why can't I just sit on the bench? Why do I need to pair up with someone and share a coffee? So here this flip of values could be made explicit if you think in the discussion about who you would annoy with your intervention, and that would be like a great news.
100%. In my experience, a newspaper headline and a short paragraph are the most economical way of world building. So I've had students try to do more things, and always found that if I just force them to write a sensationalist headline and maybe a short story that comes with it, so much of the world, you know, is visible, including those who you know, would abuse the technology, those who celebrate the technology. So it really brings, because before there's a question, right, when you redesign the technology, so what's it called? Who uses it, right? So there is an attention to users, but it's a very, I think, very kind of instrumental, or almost like a functionalist, right? So, well, it's a garbage can. Who's going to use it? Well, people who need to dump garbage. But of course, there are those who hate the noise that the machine makes, and those who find that the door impinges on the sidewalk and whatnot. And that world building, I think is really important, and quite frankly, it's really kind of the hidden outcome here. That these are just kind of shortcuts to really start imagining implications into the future, which is what a lot of futures work is about. But instead of doing a 2x2 scenario analysis and picking up your trends or drivers, you can just write a newspaper article. So that kind of helps as well. All right, and it's nice to see you. Nice to see you, Laura. Hope to see you again soon. Thanks for the invitation. I guess we can close it here, Christina.
Thanks
so much,
both of you and everybody. Bye.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
My pleasure.
See ya.
Thanks, Roy. Bye.
Bye.